I want to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy day to attend tonight's presentation and welcome you to tonight's speaker series event featuring Dr. Michael Jensen. A special thank you to the coaches and team members of the A. Craig Baer Debate Forum for shouldering the burden of tournament preparation, enabling me to engage in the administration of this week's speaker series event. Your selflessness is only matched by your generosity. A shout out to the team of Mae Sanders and Ryan Kavanaugh for placing 17th in the nation at the first tournament of the year, losing a close 2-1 debate to our friends at Kansas, just missing the top 10 by a single ballot. Tonight's event is a continuation of a 162-year history of Iowa debate, hosting public forums, engaging diverse populations in the discussion of contemporary controversies in the hopes of bridging relationships to erect solutions to issues that plague our communities. This is the second of 2 presentations. On Sunday, Dr. Jensen unpacked and analyzed data connected to Russian and Chinese interference in U.S. elections. Tonight, Dr. Jensen shall describe the narrative strategies deployed by the Russian media and intelligence agencies to frame their military actions in the Ukraine. Dr. Jensen is an associate professor at the Center for Change Governance at the University of Canberra. He's testified as an expert on information warfare before the Australian Parliament and regularly makes appearances on media outlets. He's consulted and produced reports for the U.S. Department of Defense and the Australian Department of Defense. He's well published with articles in political science, international affairs, and information technologies, including books published with Cambridge University Press and Palgrave. More importantly, Mike is one of ours. Mike earned his Bachelor of Science degree in political science from Iowa and debated for the A. Craig Baer Debate Forum. Mike joined the coaching staff in 1999 and was on the staff when Iowa Debate won back-to-back national titles. He later went on to the University of California, Irvine to earn his PhD. He's taught at the University of California, Irvine, the Autonomous University of Barcelona, and the Australian National University's National Security College. This event is made possible through the generous patronage of alumni, the financial sponsorship of University College, and the backing of the Office of the Provost. If you're interested in supporting the continuation of events like this, please consider donating to Iowa Debate at www.uiowa.edu. During the presentation, I ask that all online participants mute their microphones and that our in-person audience members silence their phones. Dr. Jensen will answer audience questions at the end of the presentation. Again, thank you for coming, and I invite you to participate in the discussion following Mike's presentation. Without delay, Dr. Jensen.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Paul. It's quite an honor to be able to come back to Iowa City and talk about my research here. Earlier today, I was buying some beer to take back to Australia because we have better beer in the United States than we do in Australia. And somebody asked, are you over 21 years of age? And it occurred to me, no, actually, it's been about 21 years since I was last in Iowa City. The work that I'm going to present tonight bears a relationship to work that I actually began as a student, as an undergraduate student at the University of Iowa, when I took a number of classes from professors who happened to be working on a National Science Foundation project, a very large multi-million-dollar project to study democratization in the former Soviet Union. And during my time at the A. Craig Baer Debate Forum, I became known for doing lots and lots of research on anything related to Russia. And that knowledge, that background, is in part what was a springboard that enabled me to do the work that I've been doing to present research on information warfare operations that were going on in the early days of the war in Ukraine. So tonight, I'm going to talk about the main influence operations that Russia was using to try to frame the situation prior to the start of the war, as well as the response of principally the United States in terms of declassifying intelligence in a fairly radical way to warn allies, as well as Ukraine itself, about the dangers of an invasion that was impending. So before I get to the specific evidence of these operations, I'm going to go through some theoretical preliminaries, because I think it's important to get the terms and the way of thinking right about what's involved in an influence operation. And I'm going to suggest that we need concepts that go beyond our traditional ways of talking about, for example, fake news or even misinformation and disinformation. The techniques that are used in modern influence operations are far more sophisticated than simply presenting false information. And false information is hardly an explanation about why anybody would have any particular reason to believe that, especially if you consider Aristotle's writings on the subject that truth always has a decided advantage in the course of an argument. When you think about that, then to understand how these operations work, you need to look at some of the more subtle mechanisms through which influence is carried out. I'm going to go through some of the propaganda themes in the pre-war period. I'm going to talk about some of the competing narratives between the United States and Russia during that time. And I'm going to look at some ways in which we can measure the diffusion dynamics and the effects that they had overall to assess whether or not these propaganda techniques have an effect on audiences. So to begin with, we need to have a basic understanding of what influence operations do. Ultimately, they try to have some sort of effect on a political system. And the way they do that is they introduce stress in some way. And that stress is introduced by creating an issue. An issue is essentially presenting something before the people that demands that the authorities of a political system take action in some way. And there are two kinds of issues that can be introduced. One is a decision issue, and that's simply, should we adopt policy A or not? Or should we adopt some alternative policy? Alternatively, issues can be introduced in terms of what are called orientation issues. And that's the kind of issue that says, should we align ourselves with something or against something? Now, these are concepts that were developed in a framework of the political system that was created back in the 1960s by my doctoral mentor, Dr. David Easton. These concepts are usually thought about in the terms of a national political system, although Easton noted that in every relevant respect, we can apply these internationally. So if we think about orientation issues in terms of influence operations that we talked about on Sunday with respect to, should we, for example, identify with Republicans or Democrats, Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, and so forth, we can also think about that in terms of, should we identify with countries like Ukraine? Are they deserving of our support, or are they, as we'll see, the Russians talked about them, essentially a Nazi junta? And that would change our estimations about whether or not we should be giving them military aid or allowing them to be, quote, denazified and demilitarized. Now, underlying these different kinds of issues, I've identified different logics that help us understand how the appeals to certain kinds of issues can gain traction in a society. And I've differentiated decision issues and orientation issues by whether or not they correspond to an information logic or an identity logic. And these logics are differentiated according to three different attributes. First of all, they're differentiated in terms of their temporal dimensions, that is the time. So information is fast and changing, and it must be constantly updated. You read a newspaper once and it's information, you read it a second time and it's more like literature. Whereas identity doesn't need updating. Instead, identity binds us over time. It shows our continuity. In terms of the targets of communication, information describes a situation or a context, whereas identities are all about particular actors. And that has consequences for the means of relating, because information is descriptive and neutral in orientation. We might say an apple falls out of a tree. There's no motive imputed to that. There's no person that's guilty of anything. But if you threw that apple, if we said somebody in the tree threw the apple at somebody on the ground, then you have a moralized story of a perpetrator and a victim. And that brings into this kind of moralizing emotive character such that there are good people and there are bad people. There are heroes and there are villains. There are victims and perpetrators in every narrative. And that defines our moral relationship to various entities, if you're going to identify with them or against them. Now, in the pre-war period, there were two competing narratives that the United States were putting out there and the Russians were putting out there. The Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, said before the United Nations, although American intelligence had been questioned in the past, particularly after the Iraq War, the difference now was that they were releasing intelligence not to start a war, but to try to stop a war. And they were making the claim, as Russia was making official denials. Some of these denials were, they were even mocking Americans for claiming that Russia was planning to start a war by saying, tell us when the war is going to start on TV so we can know when to plan our vacations. They even presented this evidence as early as November to Ukrainian authorities, who were just as surprised as most other people were that there was a war plan. In fact, there was a story in the Washington Post recently that said that the aides to Zelensky had met with State Department officials one morning in November, greeted them with a cup of coffee and said, fellas, start digging some trenches, there's going to be a war. And it took a lot of convincing of the Ukrainians to show them that, yes, there is going to be a war. You need to start planning and preparing if you want to survive this at all. Foreign decision makers were the primary target for these statements. That is, people in Ukraine as well as NATO allies and people in the European Union. The reason for that was that in order to effectively create a sanctions regime, we needed to convince people that you need to get sanctions ready because there'll be a war that's going to happen. Additionally, it was to also generate the coalition of democratic countries that have been supplying military hardware to Ukraine to help keep them in the fight. And so there are a couple expectations I have about this. The first is that reporting about the declassification of Russian intentions will increase over time and constantly be updated as events on the ground changes. And this corresponds to that temporal dimension I just talked about. And secondly, I'd argue that reporting about Russian strategic interests and the classification of their strategic interests and their intention to invade will be carried out in a relatively neutral semantic tone as opposed to something that's strongly negative or strongly positive. And that corresponds to that moralizing relationship I talked about a moment ago. On the contrary, Russia was promoting the story that Ukraine was a Nazi regime and that it needed to be demilitarized and denazified. They had stories, for example, in TASS newspaper, the English language version, about 1,000 people getting together in early January in Kyiv to remember somebody who had some Nazi ties, allegedly, many years in the past. And that became what some people might call, what Kenneth Burke calls a representative anecdote, by which people come to know what it is to be Ukrainian. When all you hear are stories about Nazis in Ukraine, you begin to identify Nazis with Ukraine. Now, it leaves aside the fact that there are people who profess allegiance to Nazism or hold white supremacist and anti-Semitic beliefs in a lot of places, including Russia itself. However, we expect that in the reporting, there should be lower levels of reporting about this Nazi story in that pre-war period because it doesn't need to be updated. If there were allegedly essentially Nazis on January 1st, it's not like the country had changed its character on January 2nd that you needed to update it in some way. It's a constant theme. So I don't expect that we'd see an increase in reporting from Russian propaganda sources that would suggest that. That's the temporal dimension. Additionally, I suspect that there will be differences between the covert and the overt forms of reporting. Now, remember a moment ago I mentioned that Russian Today and other overt Russian sources were making official denials that there were any plans to invade Ukraine during the months of January and February of this year. However, we saw in the prior to the Afghan invasion in 1979, they did the same thing. At the same time, however, there are a number of sources that have been reported by US agencies like the Department of Treasury with our sanctions documents that have indicated that these front organizations are covers for different parts of the Russian National Intelligence Services. And so being able to know those things ahead of time, we can flag those particular sources to see if they're producing different content. And I would expect that in contrast to the content in the overt propaganda outlets like Russia Today, where they were denying there's any invasion, these sources would be the ones that are engaged in what's called a shaping operation. These are the sources that would be trying to project the image that Ukraine is a violent and dangerous place. So that could serve then as a predicate later on that people like Putin and other supporters and enablers could then point to say, look, Russia was justified in invading Ukraine. So the data I collected data from a few different sources. First of all, I collected data from Twitter, from their streaming API, application programming interface. And this is from the free, openly available stream, which gives you up to about 3,000 tweets per minute, or 1% of their total overall volume at any given time. The data was a subset for analytical reasons into the period from the 16th to the 25th of February, so we can see that lead up and initial start of the war. Additionally, I looked at a period from the 24th of March through the 24th of April, so this was after the war had been underway for some time. And I also included the first parts of the liberation of the areas around Kyiv, including when they uncovered all those war crimes in Bucha the first weekend of April. And finally, I looked at a period of time, that as a concentrated analysis of that period of time to understand what was going on in Bucha and how people were reporting on it. Additionally, I collected news using the global database of events, language, and tone, which is a massive project that it developed out of Google's Jigsaw initiative, which collects news from all over the world. I focused only on the English language news because that would at least indicate a particular target audience, and English language content constitutes about 60% of all content on the internet. These data were collected from the 1st of January through the 1st of March of this year, so we could get the lead up to the war and the first week or so of the fighting. And out of that, I was able to extract 57,475 URLs. The GDAL data will give you the URL to every article, as well as a lot of metadata on it, like the tone, who's mentioned it, and so forth. By using the CrowdTangle data on these URLs, I'm able to get aggregate data on both the public and private sharing of these links on Facebook, as well as the levels of aggregate engagement with these links. So it's privacy compliant because I don't know who shared or liked any of these links, but at the same time, we're able to get a pretty comprehensive summary of the activity that's going on. And this would allow us to analyze the diffusion of different articles about the Ukraine war based upon metadata, that is, data about the articles themselves. So we can analyze some of these hypotheses that I mentioned a moment ago. Finally, these are some of the methods I used to identify some of the covert operations that were going on. Based upon previous research that's been done on the Internet Research Agency trolls, we have some ideas about some of the tactics and techniques and procedures that Russia covert influence operations use. So one of the things that we found in the past is they often engage in what's called a flooding operation, where they just put out lots and lots of tweets. And so I wanted to look at accounts that, for example, produced at least 150 tweets a day, the period, the 21st to the 23rd of February. That would be the period of time right before the war started. And the theory here is these accounts, if they're covert accounts out there, they would be the ones that are also participating in these shaping operations because they do not directly speak for the Russian government. And so they can engage in this narrative telling about how dangerous and violent and Nazified Ukraine is without the Russian government, which had already boxed itself in saying, no, we have no plans to invade, admitting that they are essentially engaged in a lie when they made that claim. Additionally, I went and looked at the accounts in this pre-war period between the 15th and the 16th and the 25th of February that had shared links to known pro-Russian propaganda outlets at least twice. I mean, if they did it once, maybe that was commenting on something, but twice starts to show a little bit of a pattern. Finally, I segmented out these accounts, the high-level tweeting accounts, and I looked for just the accounts that had subsequently been suspended about a month after this activity took place, because Twitter is known to suspend accounts for violating their terms of service, and it turns out that being part of a covert, coordinated influence activity is one of the things that will violate the terms of service on Twitter. And so by using these processes, we can start to triangulate and see, are there some consistent patterns that would show that something is happening in that pre-war period? So first of all, this is the aggregate distribution of the various narratives on Twitter between the U.S. story that they're declassified intelligence, Russia is going to invade Ukraine, and we can see up until about the 21st of February, that narrative's doing pretty well compared to the story that Ukraine is essentially a Nazi state, or that they're engaging in some form of provocation that would justify Russia to invade. So that merits then greater attention to figure out, well, what led to the change on the 21st up until the early phases of the war that would indicate that the more of that Nazi story is coming out. One of the other things I looked at was I extracted the headlines from all of these articles, because I wanted to analyze that hypothesis about the tone. Is it true that these stories that in the U.S. narrative about Russia's intentions to invade Ukraine, are those presented in a neutral tone, or are they presented more in this kind of moralizing, emotive tone, which would signal that it was more of an identity logic rather than an information logic targeted at decision makers? And it turns out no matter how I used sentiment classifiers, I used 3 different ones, they were all exactly neutral in their mean scores. Now, if you went out about 6 to 8 decimal places, you'd start to see some small numbers there. But rounded to 3 decimal places, which is pretty conventional, it's exactly 0. And certainly it's closer to 0 than the headlines that claimed that Ukraine was a Nazi regime. Those are all negative. And the difference between these two is not marginal. It's a statistically significant difference using what are called paired t-tests. I also wanted to look at the diffusion of these narratives, because I wanted to see, is it the case that only those kind of identity narratives, the ones that really pull at you to make you feel insecure and identify, try to move your identification to either in favor or against something, as opposed to just giving you information and trying to inform you about a situation. And it turns out that actually, although there were fewer tweets about the declassified intelligence, the mean level retweets and the median level, or I should say the median level retweets, were some of the highest when it came to this declassification intelligence. The fact that the means were lower suggests that a lot of the other diffusion was probably the result of bot traffic, which increased its reach. And that suggests that a lot of what we are seeing, perhaps with the apparent success of the Nazi story and the Ukrainian provocation story, was more likely due to inauthentic diffusion during that period, especially right before the war, when we saw in that chart those narratives had greater reach. In terms of the overall news reporting based on news articles on the web, Sure enough, we can see the increasing urgency. There's greater reporting about the declassification of Russia's strategic intentions to invade. As Russia was making denials, claiming they're moving troops back, there would be more evidence to say, no, our intelligence shows they haven't moved troops away from the border, or if they have, it's only to move them to another place in which they may be better prepared to invade. Meanwhile, we can see at the bottom, there isn't much of a growth in the level of reporting about Ukraine essentially being a Nazi state. In fact, the biggest jump that we see in that happens actually after the invasion begins on the 24th of February as a after-the-fact justification for the invasion. Now, this is a plot of all the tweets that were going on, at least in that 1% stream I talked about. And you can see leading up to the war, there were certainly some spikes in activity where they're reaching about 180,000 tweets per hour at various points in time. That corresponds to some of the periods of time when Putin was going on television with these really bizarre meetings. And if you looked at the watches, you could see his, quote, final decision was actually rendered prior to the decision, the statements in favor of reaching out to protect the Russian-speaking peoples in Ukraine that were made by members of the security services. So it was all a show, but that's those early spikes that you can see in the data over there. However, at exactly 3 a.m. UTC or Greenwich Mean Time on the 24th of February, when Putin's speech ended, where he said, we have begun the, quote, liberation of Ukraine, that's when the tweets take off and they max out. In fact, that's what the full Twitter stream looks like, where they reached over 700,000 tweets per hour. Up to that point, we're capturing pretty much all the tweets. Similarly, if you look at the official state Twitter accounts from their state media organizations like Sputnik and Russia Today, as well as their diplomatic accounts, that third spike from the right jumps up at exactly 3 a.m. UTC when the war begins, when the official state media and diplomatic entities have been marshaled into action to provide justification for the war. And these are only tweets about Ukraine. However, if we look at the tweets, about from accounts that have tweeted at least twice, links to Russian propaganda sources, curiously at 3 a.m. UTC on the 24th, their level of productivity drops. And if we look at the accounts that were suspended, that had been publishing at least 150 tweets per day, likewise, 3 a.m. UTC, the 24th of February, as the war starts, their activity plummets too. And it's even more profound here. Now, we've seen similar patterns like this before. I talked about this on Sunday night. This is a flooding pattern that happened during the 2016 US election, where these accounts, the day before it was disclosed that Russia was meddling in the US election to help Donald Trump and undermine Hillary Clinton, you had a big level of activity, and then that dropped off once it was the 7th of October, and that was the day that that announcement was made that Russia was interfering. There's also a lot of other things going on that day. They weren't trying to interact with or try to spin those events. They were trying to get their message out before they were going to be outed effectively to the American public. And so there's some previous evidence that they do the same sorts of patterns prior to something they know is going to happen. And that gives some credence to the idea that Russia's covert influence operation services, which include the Internet Research Agency, but other entities as well, were engaged in an influence operation prior to the war starting, and they were told to step back once the war started, and that's when the overt sources could take over and start to direct the messaging. Now, in terms of the article distribution, I broke down the article distribution into 4 different categories. The blue bars are the overall total of that nearly 400,000 articles that I collected from the GDAL data that I talked about. The red line is a list of the top 20 US news sources and pretty much follows the same patterns. The orange line is the production of articles about Ukraine from the overt Russian propaganda sources like Sputnik, TASS, and Russia Today, and so forth. And then the green line are the covert Russian propaganda sources, that is, sources that are affiliated with their different intelligence services and the front organizations run by them, such as the Strategic Culture Foundation, which has been sanctioned by the United States government, the New Eastern Outlook, which is a FSB publication, their domestic security services. The FSB is in charge of the entire intelligence operations for the former Soviet space. They didn't produce a high volume, but they did produce content, and it's worthwhile taking a look at some of the differences between these. And I put the US top news up, the Russian covert propaganda, their overt propaganda, so you can get a sense of the level of violence that they're projecting about the situation in Ukraine, so you can see by comparison. And you notice for the most part, the green lines, that's the Russian Federation covert propaganda sources, nearly 100% of their articles have references to violence in Ukraine. And that, on average, if you run the average of those lines, it's higher than that for the US press, which is the blue line. However, the overt propaganda sources, which were downplaying the threat of war, are consistently lower, which also provides support for the hypothesis that I made earlier, distinguishing the overt versus their covert reporting. These differences are also statistically significant. Now, I was curious about the diffusion of propaganda sources on Facebook, because it's not enough just to say, there's some effort to distort what's going on or to manipulate publics. We want to understand also what drives people to pick this stuff up and post it and engage with the content. Because once they engage with the content, that drives the algorithms and makes stuff appear on more pages and gets more attention online and can reach more eyeballs and influence more people. And so I used a multi-level regression method, and I'm happy to talk about that. The methodologists in the room are interested in discussing that. But it's a way to control for the fact that certain outlets are by nature going to receive more attention. So for example, these obscure Russian covert propaganda outlets, they just don't quite have the following that, say, the New York Times does or the Washington Post does. So I can control for that. And what I find is that across both the models, whether you're talking about the diffusion, that is the posting of these articles on Facebook, tone matters, and it's negative tone specifically. When I ran additional models that contrasted positive tone, because articles can be have lots of positive statements as well as lots of negative statements in them, and that just makes them highly polarized. Consistently was the negative statements that was the greatest driver of whether or not an article was posted, and even more so, whether or not people clicked on the article and clicked a like or some other form of engagement with those articles. Additionally, I found, especially for the diffusion of the articles, sources like Russia Today and sources from the Valdai Group as well as Sputnik were much more likely than the average link to get posted on those sites. And that would be consistent with an organized influence operation on Facebook to try to post those links so they get greater visibility. They certainly didn't get as much engagement, so that suggests that perhaps there isn't as much organic enthusiasm for those particular articles. But it does suggest the fact that they were put out there in greater numbers, more so than, say, the BBC or articles from MSNBC or even CNN, that there was an organized effort to promote these to get more attention. And the highest of all these were articles from the Valdai Group, which is a foreign policy think tank closely aligned with Vladimir Putin. Now, we talk a lot about propaganda in the English language. The second most common language for tweets about Ukraine on Twitter were in Spanish. In fact, out of that second corpus that spanned from roughly the end of March through the end of April, there are about 46 million tweets, 31 million of them are English. Twitter machine codes these language differences. There are about 5.6 million that were in Spanish. Now, you might have picked up on in Paul's introduction that I've taught at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. In fact, I lived in Barcelona for about 5 years. And my wife's from Barcelona. So during that time, I learned how to speak Spanish, and I went and translated the top 6 most retweeted tweets in Spanish language. And the results were interesting, to say the least. The first most retweeted tweet is a reference to Cuba, noting that it's had 63 years of peace since the socialist revolution, in contrast to Ukraine, suggesting Ukraine is a violent place. So you can see part of that shaping operation going on to target Spanish speakers, not only in Spain, of course, that's important because they're seeking to undermine cohesion within NATO and support for Ukrainian refugees that have come, fleeing the violence, but also to reach the Latin American world. And in the last 5 to 10 years, Russia Today and Sputnik have both increased their offerings in Spanish language production in order to try to gain more influence in that part of the world. The second one is a tweet that says, urgent, Russia employs white phosphorus in Ukraine. No, sorry, this is Mosul, Iraq. These are white phosphorus munitions to install democracy in Iraq. Again, this is an effort to try to undermine the attacks that have been put against Russia for using white phosphorus, especially in their early efforts to take over Mariupol. The third most retweeted tweet in Spanish was, I just turned on La Ser, which is a national radio station in Spain. They put audio of a woman in Mariupol saying, now things are more tranquil and they have food, but they translated it as, the Russians have shot grenades inside my house. Then they did the same with a man. Atlasser has no shame. It'd be really hard to go back and fact check that. I mean, unless you were in Spain, you happen to be listening to La Ser all the time, how would you know? You go to the website, there isn't a continuous transcript of everything that they put on the air. So they make these things hard to show that they're demonstrably false. Number 4, joke of the day, Israel accuses Russia of war crimes in Ukraine. Attack on Israel at the same time, saying we can't take this seriously because we think, in this case, the people tweeting this, Israel also commits war crimes. The fifth one, that's the only one that really wasn't an attack on Ukraine. It says a man was arrested in Spain for trafficking Ukrainian refugees into prostitution. The sixth one, this one's kind of interesting because it requires people to know a lot more context than most people would know about Ukraine. It says, just now in a message published on Telegram, and a lot of people on Twitter aren't on Telegram, especially in the Spanish-speaking world, Telegram doesn't have quite that reach, from a member of the Ukrainian Rada, Ilya Kiva, so he's got a name, declared publicly that the provocation in Bucha was prepared by the SBU, which is Ukraine's intelligence service, along with the British intelligence MI6. Well, you can look up Ilya Kiva, and sure enough, he was a member of the Rada. If you read a little further, though, you might also realize that he was a member of the Rada as a member of a pro-Russian party, and that he was also had fled Ukraine for Russia seeking asylum there because he was facing treason charges for helping coordinate Russian Air Force attacks in the early days of the war against Ukraine. Not exactly the most neutral, unbiased observer, but by referring to him as a member of the Ukrainian Rada, it looks like he's somebody who should be pro-Ukrainian, when indeed he was all along working to aid Russia's invasion. And he's just continuing the propaganda to aid the Russian side. Now, one of the things I wanted to look at in that period of time, I mentioned the 31st through the 1st of April, that period when they, right after they started to liberate the suburbs and get into the suburbs around Kyiv. And they found massive evidence of war crimes, particularly in Bucha. This is the date in which the accounts were created, talking about Bucha. And you notice the big spikes that happened in January and February of 2022. Well, that's interesting. What were those accounts saying about Bucha? And these were only tweets out of that I filtered first for Ukraine, right? And then I filtered out of those Ukraine tweets, Bucha specifically. And that's what they're referring to. So the most common, what are called collocations, these are pairs of words that are statistically unique and appearing together, and it's one way to start to get at the content of these tweets. They talk a lot about Vladimir Zelensky. They talk about how they've killed Jewish people, presumably, killed Ukrainians. Bucha massacre is also amongst some of the most common phrases. Kyiv Oblast, using the English spelling of Kyiv that corresponds to the Ukrainian, rather than the Russian Kiev. These appear to be tweets from an Ukrainian covert influence operation, and you notice that the accounts, these are only accounts that were created after the 1st of January 2022. That corresponds with the story that we've heard coming out of the reporting about Ukrainians not believing that an invasion was happening and them taking time to prepare. So it would appear that they started after the 1st of this year to create a whole bunch of Twitter accounts to use in their information operations. But it's not something that they were starting in November when they were first told an invasion is coming. So what are the conclusions? Well, I think there's significant evidence that helps justify using this differentiation between orientation issues and decision issues, and points to those differing underlying logics that separate the two of them. In terms of the targeted definition, the declassification narrative from the United States targeted decision makers. And they pointed to situations and actions in fairly neutral tones as opposed to moralizing tones of like an actor did something bad. Additionally, the Russian propaganda depicted Nazism and violence in Ukraine, thereby painting Ukraine as a bad actor, morally undeserving, and certainly not worthy of aid or the sanctions regime that was put in place in order to support them against Russia. The temporal dimensions, that also we find support for. The information about Russia's intentions appeared with increasing volume as the war approached, as new reporting came out and there are charges made against the Western intelligence. They would respond, presenting more evidence, and there'd be more reporting on. This was communicated to this body, and it was accepted as valid, and people tended to agree with over time. There was that process that got the buy-in amongst key decision makers in the European Union, as well as America's NATO allies, which led to that initial regime providing military support as well as creating plans to enact sanctions once the violence began. Meanwhile, we saw more or less just a small trickle of reporting about Nazis in Ukraine. In fact, there are only about 212 of those nearly 400,000 articles that included that in the headline. And the biggest spike in the appearance of those articles occurred only once the violence had begun, as an after-the-fact justification for Russia having gone and invaded to begin with. In terms of the mode of relation, we found that the Nazi claims were strongly negative. In fact, when I looked at the articles, the underlying, of course, these were more extremely negative in their overall tone than just the headlines indicated. Meanwhile, although the articles talking about Russia's strategic intentions to invade Ukraine had a neutral headline tone and still had a negative overall article tone because they were talking about a war is going to break out, these were less negative than the claims that were highly emotionalized in those Nazi articles. And the differences, again, on both measures were statistically significant. Some of the larger conclusions, though, that I take from this research is that I think it provides an alternative to the ways we talk about influence activities. At the start, I already signaled that I think there's a problem with us focusing on simply the idea that the problem is false information is getting out there, whether we call it fake news or we call it disinformation or misinformation. And the reason for that is that allows newspapers like TASS to get away with the solitary story about a group of people getting together in Kyiv to remember somebody who potentially had some Nazi ties in their past. Because that may very well be true. And if you only read those kinds of stories, you may draw the conclusion that Ukraine is essentially a Nazi-sympathizing country. However, that doesn't support that justification. It doesn't establish a generalized tendency in the culture or orientation of the regime. It ignores the fact that the president himself is Jewish and the former prime minister was Jewish. So those are claims that are not really challenged. But at the same time, that statement itself could be true in its own terms, but still lead people to adopt an essentially errant generalization about what was going on in Ukraine. Additionally, this approach analytically has some advantages because it allows us to scale to very high volumes of content. If we had to go through and individually fact-check each and every single statement, I mean, as we saw with some of those Spanish tweets, that's pretty hard. In fact, in some cases, things that we read online don't exactly have obviously clear criteria that would establish them being true or false. I mean, if you had lots of tweets that say we should always oppose Nazis, okay, well, maybe we should as a normative injunction, but there's a set of facts that would justify or invalidate that claim. And it'd be a subtle way to kind of cue that other narrative that people have made elsewhere saying, there are some Nazis in Ukraine, and indeed, there probably are. There are also Nazis in Russia. There are also Nazis in America. But that hardly is a justification to go to war against the country. The point is that this would be conceptually far more exhaustive than focusing only on those limited cases of misinformation or disinformation, cases where we can demonstrably show that the information being put out there is false. Because a lot of times people will be even quoted as saying, so an article that quoted Vladimir Putin as saying something essentially false, that Ukraine is essentially a Nazi state, for example, you could truthfully quote Vladimir Putin as having said that. But the fact that you made that the centerpiece of the article, that was essentially the headline of the article, the way to frame the discussion, already tilts the audience to thinking about that as a subject matter. And this points to other alternatives in terms of combating manipulation efforts. One is to focus on resilience. So if the issue is people are maligning the functioning of whether it's the Ukrainian political system or the American political system. We hear a lot today about this idea of the West versus the rest. During the COVID lockdown periods, there are a lot of debates about whether or not democracies had the capacity to effectively control COVID the way, say, China did. Well, one of the things we might think about is, how do we rebuild that support for democracy? How do we make democracies more effective? And how do we rebuild the normative valuation that democracy is the only form of government that we're willing to live under? And this is important because studies have shown consistently over the last 20 years, there's been a sharp decline, particularly amongst younger people, and the belief that democracy is effective and the only form of acceptable governance. And that's in the United States as well as across most of the European countries. And even in Australia, we've seen the same trends, particularly declining since 2004. So it's something that we really need to be concerned about. How do we rebuild faith in democracy as well as rebuild capacities of our political system? And that also relates to the fact that we allow a lot of these manipulation efforts to polarize. They target the political community, that is the organization of us as citizens bound together in some way, so that whenever a government, whichever one's in power, tries to do something, it's viewed as illegitimate, I mean, we've seen this with the last election here, where there's lots of election deniers who don't believe Joe Biden legitimately won the election to begin with. And so he has to do extra work to show that what he's doing is of benefit to people who don't believe he legitimately should be in the White House to begin with. So by building that resilience in our society, that people don't have to view each other as mortal enemies in the society, as us versus them, and that politicization of the culture, that also can be an important site of building resilience. Finally, this approach avoids ceding the agenda setting to the adversary. If our task in combating manipulation and influence operations from Russia or anywhere else were simply to fact check it away, to respond and say that's not true, apart from the fact that there's a lot of other ways, and the majority of the ways in which they try to manipulate us don't involve demonstrably false statements, we risk ceding the agenda to the enemy. And consequently, we do not focus on trying to change that narrative and show how the way we do things here is actually better. I think Ukraine serves a good lesson in this regard. They haven't focused much on trying to rebut the statements that they're a Nazi regime. Rather, they focused on Russia's committed scores of war crimes. And as settlements have been liberated around Izum in the recent days, they've been finding increased evidence of mass graves and torture chambers and so forth that have been carried out by the Russians during their occupation. And they've contrasted that with stories from Russian POWs about how well the Ukrainian forces have treated Russian POWs. So against that narrative that Russia's trying to put out there of Ukrainians essentially being Nazis, you hear these stories of Russians perpetuating atrocities and Ukrainians acting with humanity, even in the face of those atrocities. And that's a probably much more powerful message than to simply say, the president is Jewish and there's no evidence of systematic Nazism in the society. I'll leave it at that, and I'm open for questions from anybody online or in the audience. Thank you very much.
I have a clarification question.
Yes.
When you refer to pre-war period, you mean the pre-February 24th, not the pre-2014 when the war started?
That's correct. I think that's an important point of discussion. For many in Ukraine, the war started in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and the invasion of the Donbass. So when I mean that the pre-war period, obviously there was a much larger mobilization of information capabilities at the point in time before this massive movement of troops came into Ukraine and they tried to seize the whole country.
I would just, as a Ukrainian, I would suggest you to use the pre-invasion, switch the pre-war to pre-invasion to differentiate between the two periods.
Well,
Because this is a very discussed point in the media, also including the Western media, to be able to differentiate between the pre-war period, so the pre-2014 period in Ukraine, and then use either the full-scale invasion or at least use just the pre-invasion period to point out that the invasion started in February of this year, so then you have acknowledgement that the war started earlier and not adding to the disinformation narratives that Russia provides, right, to use just the pre-invasion period and not the pre-war period.
so I was a little torn on that issue because I also think of that early period as an invasion. I mean, that was moving into Ukrainian territory. And so in that sense, I mean, I guess the question is what captures that better? Either, you know, is the 2014 the start of the war or the start of the invasion?
Well, so the Ukrainian government uses the language that they use is the full-scale invasion, right? So to describe the events that began in February, and then war to describe everything else that started with the invasion of Crimea. So, and I think that I've read a lot of discussion about like these terms, and I do think that differentiating differentiating the pre-war to pre-invasion makes sense. Like what I think it would be probably the best approach is to say that this is pre-full-scale invasion and then just switch it to the pre-invasion as a suggestion. Because like it's not that like I'm being picky and I'm sorry if that's how it feels, but
I'm an academic. We are very picky.
yeah. So like the reason why I think this is important to differentiate between it is that because this adds to the Russian disinformation campaign, saying that they weren't in Donbass in 2014. They never, annexed Crimea. The people in Crimea decided via referendum that they want to join Russia. And, academics, by using the pre-war, like pre-February of this year, adds to the Russian disinformation campaign that we didn't do anything in Ukraine over the last 8 years. We were just there over the past 7 months.
Okay, so analytically it gets in some tricky areas because there are debates about what constitutes war. And so you can have fighting that is not rising to a level of war if there's, I think it's roughly 1,000 combatant casualty, less than 1,000 combatant casualties.
More than 10,000 Ukrainians died over the period of 8 years, which constitutes the definition of war.
Well, it depends on how many per year. And then there's the question about, would that include Crimea? So you ironically exclude Crimea. There are different definitional debates that put on there, but the larger point for me is I'm not beholden to any particular language, but certainly I think there was a significant difference at the point when they started moving directly on Kyiv. Now, what was the operations with Crimea, the operations with the Donbass, were a slow bleed approach to try to undermine the Ukrainian state. And this then became that was not going to be effective. So they, to achieve their strategic ends, so they did a full-scale invasion. Now, that as long as we know what we're talking about, in terms of pre and post-war, I certainly would not deny that they were in the Donbass. In fact, we've seen leaked documents from the Russian defense talking about shipments of support in earlier years to their troops, which kind of gives away the lie that they weren't really there. For people who do research on gray zone and hybrid warfare, there is no question about the fact that Russian troops illegally seized Crimea, that the referenda there was a sham, and that Russian troops were on the ground and that they had pushed into prominence otherwise highly marginal figures in the Donbass region to assume authoritative political roles in that conflict to secede from Ukraine.
I'll leave it to your judgment. It's your research, but thank you.
Sure.
So that's a very interesting question. So going back to 2014, it seems like you were talking about social media was sort of the 2, 3, 4 month look back, and you were doing your analysis until the February events where things ripened into conflict. Did you take a look at Azov and Nazi and for 2014 to mid 2021 before, again, I don't want to get the number, but until the activities on Kyiv occurred, and was Russian propaganda fairly active in that period, and then how does that compare to that few months that you looked at before, or was that not part of your sample or your academic exercise?
The earlier data was not part of that, owing to the fact that so with respect to the Twitter data, I would have had to have had a continuous data collection for that entire period of time, which would have been just massive amounts of data storage. So I've not been collecting for that entire period of time without a sizable grant to be able to purchase the historical Twitter data. It'd be hard to get a hold of otherwise. with respect to the GDALT data, it's easier to retrieve going back to at least to 2015. Part of that point, they don't have the granularity at the article level. However, that's pretty large data. And so I have a pretty powerful computer on my desk, but it would probably be a bit too much for me to crunch. And so the nature of this project, this was actually something that was born out of a project I did for the Australian Department of Defense. And we were interested in that period that when it became obvious that Russia was going to invade. So that's why we started with the January data collection, and I focused especially on that week and a half before Putin made his speech and did the full-scale assault. Yeah.
I'm interested, the last thing you were talking about in terms of U.S. strategies of democracy building as a strategy of combating misinformation. I feel like one thing that we've seen post full-scale invasion is sort of this rallying of American support for Ukraine, where you see Americans who aren't Ukrainian like putting up Ukraine flags or sort of depicting Zelensky as like a hero. I'm interested in hearing about the relationship between that and sort of the U.S. temporal strategies or original kill strategies as part of combating this information and sort of like building national identity from that.
So I think those are two independent movements. Now, I didn't obviously analyze, U.S. references to Ukraine in a positive way, or the images of Zelensky, or talk about him. I think he has been, obviously very, very effective in drawing upon his skills as an actor. I'd highly recommend, you want to get real insights into him, watch his series Servant of the People, where you could see a lot of the stuff, his background ideas from years before the invasion this year. But I don't have data on that part of the story. That, in my conceptualization, would fall in more of an orientation issue with an identity logic, because that's more people identifying with Ukraine and seeing, this is the front line of the battle for democracy. And that's how they've also explained it to other outside audiences. There have been stories of meetings, video meetings with the European Union, in which they basically have said to politicians, our children are fighting and dying for your values. And the speech was so impassioned at times, there were members of the European Parliament in tears because it really struck an emotional chord with them. And it's that kind of emotional relationship to them in that positive sense that I think is really binding in terms of the identity logic, and has helped sustain the continued support. In fact, I just read today the European Union is going to introduce new sanctions based upon recent efforts to hold sham referenda declaring various parts of Ukraine to be Russian. Yeah.
So first, as someone who's really interested in digital culture, I just want to say that I appreciate your talk in terms of thinking really meta about how social media is being used as this force of influence. And I know you didn't necessarily collect this data, but now that we're coming up to about 7 months of the war being an active side of conflict, I'm curious if you have any hypotheses about how propaganda has changed, particularly through the summer and early fall, where I feel like I'm seeing less and less as merely an anecdotal example of, I suspect that that's maybe my algorithms, because I kind of doubt that Russian propaganda has really decreased.
It's still, obviously continuing. There are, a lot of stories within the Russian propaganda press that just simply deny the accounts of war crimes and the mass graves. That stuff's been continuing. I'd say one of the innovations that I've seen happen, particularly since June, so beyond the time period of data collection, this is more anecdotal, I don't have systematic collection on it, is on the pro-Ukraine side, there's been the development of the what's called NAFO, the North Atlantic Fellows Organization, which basically engages in mockery of Russia and Russian propaganda points. They've been attacked by Russian diplomats, and Russian diplomats have really gotten into this. One of them said, "You quote, you pronounce this nonsense," as they were just showing the reductio ad absurdum of the positions of Russia. At which point, then it became the retort of a lot of people aligned with NAFO to attack them. And this has been a vehicle through which lots of different memes have emerged. And they've appropriated some of the early ones, like the St. Javelin, which became popular during the Battle of Kyiv, where the Javelin missile, the Manpads, and some of these other individually launched anti-tank weapons became seen as one of the critical saviors of Kyiv. And so that's why they created the St. Javelin merchandise, part of the proceeds going to support Ukrainians. And then beyond that, they had other memes that would reflect negatively or on decision making in Russia. So there'd be like, Putin says to Shoigu, his defense minister, "Tell me how the war is going in one word." He says, "Good." And then Putin says, "Tell me how the war is going in two words." And he says, "Not good." Or they would have other ones where it would be mocking him at Putin as the quote master strategist, particularly with increasing reports that Putin was making even operational level decisions, which would normally be done by battlefield commanders, because he was so dissatisfied with the way the war was proceeding, and talking about like this. He's the master strategist as all these other calamities were unfolding on Russian forces. There's jokes about how rapidly they are advancing backwards, so at least 50% of the strategy is going correctly because the advancing part is in there. So that's, I'd say, some of the kind of meme culture, social media campaigning that's become, I think, more prominent on the pro-Ukrainian side. And it's not just the impassioned pleas of Zelensky, and especially with some of those really impactful videos, and it's something that's really hard to watch, where he was talking about Ukraine, his beloved country, and you'd see then all these landmarks getting hit with missiles. You would see bodies in the street and people injured that were really shocking to really move people to action. At the same time, you would see these other elements come into play that are more of the mockery of the other side. Now that leads to some concern that it's they don't want to make too much light of the war because this is very serious stuff. Men, women, and children, innocent people are dying every time they send their Smerch missiles or some of their ICBMs against Ukrainian targets. And so there's a tendency to want to mock the Russians and say, look, we're winning, everything's great. But that should not distract us from the fact that a lot more needs to be done because this war is not over. And there's a lot of tragedy and misery that's going on right now. And the fact of the matter is we don't hear about it. But there have been very significant Ukrainian losses, and they're going on right now even in Kherson. And it wasn't that that the southern advance was a feint to distract the Russian forces and move all their strong forces to the south while they ran through Kharkiv and made advances into the Luhansk and Donbass. They've been losing a lot of people there because Russia's created some very strong and fortified defensive positions, even in a place like Kherson, which was seen as weak defense-wise. Any questions or comments online? Okay, well, thank you very much for your questions and engagement, and I really appreciate this opportunity to share my research with you. As I said, it means a lot to come back to the University of Iowa and share that, given that some of these interests began at this very campus many, many years ago. Thanks.